But I believe now our opening keynote speaker, Tim Anderson, is with us. And so I'd love to be joined by Tim. And it's great to have you with us, Tim. And Tim is the head of transport at the Energy Saving Trust. We're delighted to have you with us. And over to you, Tim.
My name is Tim Anderson. I'm the Group Head of Transport at Energy Saving Trust, and we're a not-for-profit NGO set up to tackle the climate emergency. We work with governments, we work with businesses, we work with consumers to really give them decarbonisation solutions that are pragmatic and help us head towards a low carbon economy. I head up our transport team. That's across the UK, mainly in Scotland and England. That's where our main work happens, a little bit in Wales, and we're hoping that we can expand it a little bit further afield as well. Just want to thank my friends at Mobilityways for welcoming me. I think it's fair to say that our vision for the future of travel is very much aligned. We stand shoulder to shoulder with Mobilityways in terms of promoting different ways of travel, and the joint commitment that we have really comes across. We've been talking over the years about various different programs, and I'll return to that shortly. But the zero emission commute is very much part of this, is a really important element that I just want to talk about today. And my keynote speech, and I was reflecting actually on what does a keynote speech actually mean. If you're a musician, you'll know that if you're playing a piece of music, you can set the tone, and the tone is really whether something's loud or whether it's soft and gentle. The key is actually more important, because if everyone plays in a different key, the whole thing is a disaster. And so really, in setting the scene, in setting the key for today's event, what I want to do is remain positive, remain solution focused, even when our subject matter can lead us to feeling some of those things that we just saw on the slide there. So despair, defeat, just exasperation about where we are. I do hope, at least in the next few minutes, to leave you with a sense of hope, of what can be achieved, but also a sense that not all is lost. There is still brilliant work going on. Just to be absolutely clear, I'm not government. Energy Saving Trust is an independent and impartial organisation, and so bashing the government is not what we do. We're not necessarily a campaigning organisation either. Our main job is to deliver programs. It's to deliver projects that help people with their decarbonisation journey. So I will try and be balanced and fair. It may be difficult, but I will try my best. Okay, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into specific policies. I don't think we've got time for that. I'm not sure that would be all that interesting, but more just to give a sense of the landscape in which we are operating in at the moment. And my sense is that the politics of our sector has become increasingly toxic or polluted. I think we talk about pollution, don't we, a lot in our sector, but honestly, I think our politics has become somewhat polluted. I guess that is to be expected with our current administration struggling in the polls. Firstly, there are policies that are not even policies, and we saw some of Rishi Sunak's speech there, which in a bizarre turn of events, policies were being cancelled and scrapped, even though they weren't policies. I'm sure the good folk at Mobilityways and many of you will have been completely bemused by the scrapping of the policy to make car sharing compulsory. I must admit, when I was watching the news, I was watching that, I had a blind panic because I thought, I should know that there is a policy like this, and I really don't know. And I'm sure some of you were thinking, I didn't know anything about that. Did I miss that? Apparently not. We're all okay. That was not a real policy. But what is particularly sad for me is that the political landscape is getting increasingly um, polarized on the issue of the environment, on the issue of net zero, and even on the issue of clean air in our towns and cities. Up to now, I think we've enjoyed a relatively good consensus across the political spectrum. Parties of all colours basically looking forward to how we can deliver net zero by 2050. But sadly, this has become a political battleground. And, that is a real area of concern. I think transport in particular is an area where we're seeing the most pollution in our politics. This idea, and we saw it, didn't we, as a banner on the speech by the Prime Minister, that hardworking families are being attacked. This war against the motorist. And unfortunately, it's these hardworking families that are the people whose votes will be important in the next election. And we saw a perfect example of this was the ULEZ debate in London, which sort of acted, I think, as a key trigger to what's now playing out in our politics with the mayor of London's ULEZ zone expanding out to the M25. And that seems to have brought out the worst in politicians and also, I'm sad to say, some citizens as well. We've seen an alarming change in direction just in a really short period of time. So, for example, the ban of sale of petrol and diesel vehicles being pushed back 5 years to 2035. Um, Very unusually, we saw a consensus appearing between green campaigners on the one hand and the car industry. Absolutely extraordinary that on both opposing fronts they were coming together to say to the government, don't do this, don't do this. I suppose on the positive side, I should mention that the ZEV mandate, the zero emission vehicle mandate, has been published. And this sort of plays to what's going on here. I think the ban of sale is very sort of headline, front and center in voters' minds, but the ZEV mandate almost as powerful in changing behaviors and changing the vehicles that will be built is going ahead. That means that manufacturers will have to build an increasing proportion of zero emission vehicles starting from next year, 2024. 22% of their vehicles will need to be zero emission vehicles. So hope is not lost. Let me put it that way. And some of these background policies are still very much alive, which I think is positive. Another one we've seen, of course, is HS2. Now, don't know what you feel about HS2. I know it divides opinion. I'm somewhat split myself, to be honest, because HS2 running up to Leeds was going to run about 100 yards past my house, although no station anywhere near my house, so I probably wouldn't have got the benefit. But having been cancelled, some of the funds that would have been spent on that are now being spent on a local railway line that I will be able to use to connect where I live here in northwest Leicestershire, in Ashby de la Zouch, with cities like Burton and towns like Burton and cities like Leicester at the other end. So, yeah, difficult to really know whether HS2 is right. And on this one, I have some sympathy for the government. We're always very quick to criticise lack of investment in rail infrastructure, and we look at countries like France and Japan and Germany and even Spain now who have high speed rail, and we think, wow, why haven't we got that? And then when we start building it, we get equal amounts of criticism that it's a waste of money. So I think on this one, genuinely, I don't think the government can win. And by the way, I think the opposition will have exactly the same problem if and when they come into power. More locally, we've seen low traffic neighbourhoods being targeted, as well as the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in Wales becoming a real issue with lots of resistance against it. And these have become issues of sort of personal freedom rather than issues of safety and a positive urban environment. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted. And in people who will be attending this event, I know that you know that measures that encourage road use, more cars, more roads, open access to roads, less pedestrianisation, don't lead to more pleasant and safe places. They lead to increased congestion, noise, pollution, and sadly, road deaths. But the politicization of this issue sort of plays to this kind of increasingly individualistic mantra. What is good for me now? Not what is good for society, my community, or even our future. Finally, we've seen all of this kind of political pollution play out in our work with sudden and drastic funding cuts affecting our organisation and others. Many active travel budgets have been slashed, and ironically, Active Travel England, set up by DfT to deliver these projects, is now taking DfT to court over funding cuts. As I say, Energy Saving Trust and other organisations that I'm closely linked to have seen drastic cuts that have led to a complete reduction in the work that we're able to do, and the terrible pain of job cuts. For some organisations, it's existential. It's so disappointing. We were actually discussing plans, Basil and I, for some program activity, funded program activity, to look at Commute Zero and the zero emission commute. And sadly, these funding streams have been cut even since the minister's trip to Delft in June. So it's so disappointing that with projects ready to go, those have been sidelined. We do remain, of course, hopeful that some funding will be available in the future. I do just want to have a little bit of empathy for the voter, though, because sometimes we get locked in our echo chamber, don't we? We kind of get so obsessed with our activism that actually perhaps we've got a temptation to forget what these so-called working families are actually going through. Folks just trying to live their lives, work hard and provide for their families, who may well have an agnostic view of climate change. Let's face it, we're living in a cost of living crisis. I don't think there'll be anybody on this call who won't have been affected by high interest rates or high prices. And anything that's going to increase the burden on families, particularly households with lower incomes, is not going to be well received, not by them or by the politicians that represent them. So adding costs like surcharges in a clean air zone will feel like a kick in the teeth. Also, when we think about the legacy of COVID, and more of us working from home, just like I am right now in Northwest Leicestershire, for the zero carbon commute, of course, there's nothing better. I haven't had to leave my house. Strangely, though, the roads and the public transport network still seems to be creaking. It seems busier than ever. I do find myself wondering, where on earth are all these people going if they're not going into the office? There does seem to be less capacity, and particularly on the railways, I'm noticing fewer and shorter trains. But clearly, the revolution that we were expecting in our working practices hasn't delivered those long-term solutions. When it comes to public transport, often the perception is that it's not appealing or adequate. Some of you may well remember or know the quote from Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister, who said that anyone who remained dependent on public transport at the age of 26 was a failure. What does that tell you about our national psyche towards public transport? And it is sadly seen as a second class way of travelling. And when the cost is extortionate, which often it is, it feels like a double blow. I know many of you will defend the railways. I'm a very regular railway user, as you would expect. And I'm sorry to say that I often find them expensive, overcrowded, unreliable, and sometimes quite antisocial places to be. And it shouldn't be that way. One of the things that I feel personally should be at the top of the agenda is the idea of nationalising public transport, so that rather than subsidising cheap public transport in other countries, which is so often the case with our public transport operators, we should have our own truly public transport system that is always the cheapest way to travel. Don't get me wrong, I love cars. For many people, cars are aspirational. We enjoy buying them, we enjoy driving them, we enjoy owning them. And for many, they are a status symbol. But of course, we know that the car industry employs a lot of people. But it's an inefficient way of traveling, isn't it? For 99% of the time, they sit outside on the driveway, this huge 20, 30, 40, 50,000 pound asset. Really wasteful. And of course, car sharing makes perfect sense, as I'm sure you all will agree. But demonizing it, as we saw in the Prime Minister's speech, does nothing to help. So I guess just bringing this bit into land, we can all empathize a little bit with the voting public. And we need to center solutions on how people really feel, not how we think they should feel. The alternative to individual car use needs to be systemic. Like the beaching rail cuts of the 1960s reflected the shift towards car use, we now need an equally radical shift away to new ways of travel. So just to finish, 5 things that I think we can do together as a community of stakeholders in this sector to provide a way forward to move away as much as we can from the individual car journey. The first one is grand policy. What we need are big targets, a little bit like net zero in 2050. We need the same thing for transport. The closest that I can think of is the Scottish target to achieve a 20% reduction in car kilometres by 2030. That's the sort of policy that gets us to net zero. That's the sort of policy that focuses our minds and delivers a pathway. Secondly, technology. Technology will deliver a lot of solutions for us. And it was really heartening to see in the video at the beginning of the event, Jesse Norman visiting the DERFT site and talking about net zero, sorry, commute zero, which is something that, you know, we do want to aspire to. It's great that in the background, you've got Mobilityways technology actually delivering these solutions in a real world environment at scale. And just the minister being there is a fabulous endorsement. Similar scheme up in the Highlands of Scotland, Go High, but in a very different setting, providing a similar mobility as a service type platform for rural communities up in the Highlands of Scotland, and really interesting way of actually making that work. I would say, though, quite a few mass platforms are struggling to get a foothold with the public, and mass market mobility as a service seems a little bit of a distance away. Thirdly, collaboration. No one organization, not Energy Saving Trust, not Mobilityways, or anyone else can do this on our own. We need a sense of community across our networks so that we can work together on delivering the zero carbon commute, sorry. I've been talking with the Urban Mobility Partnership, another network of organizations, and that's really interesting. Sort of collaborative spirit coming together of organizations. We need more of that. Fourthly, we need leadership in this area. Now, I'm not sure central government is going to be on our side for a while. There's going to be sort of pro-motoring policies, I think, as we get closer to a general election. So I think policy leadership needs to come from elsewhere. And a lot of that will be local government or regional government. And that's where we need to see real leadership happening, but also with large employers. Well thought through local policies that can focus on the benefits can be sold in a positive light to make local people shift their habits. So the trick for our community is to convince people that investment in this area is important, whether that's local government, where we know there's pressure on frontline services, or businesses, where we also know there's pressure on bottom lines. It's tough, but that's probably where the leadership's going to come from. Fifthly, and finally, a radical concept, moving the donkey. In other words, carrots and sticks, incentives and disincentives. There's a low, when we're in a political storm as we are, there's a low appetite for sticks, let's face it. Anything that makes motoring more expensive or more difficult with an election looming is probably going to be off the cards for now. Having said that, there is there are some carrots around, and one particular one that I think's been interesting and really positive is the £2 bus fare cap for bus journeys, which I've made use of actually, and I think it's brilliant. I mean, sadly, when I was speaking to somebody from one of the big bus companies, they told me it hasn't actually had that much difference on bus patronage. But I think it is a bold gesture. It's actually sending a message that public transport can be cost effective, and particularly if you're traveling any distance, £2 can can be can feel like a real bargain, especially with fuel prices rising again. So I'm hoping that the availability of that incentive through to December 24 will encourage people to shift their habits and move onto the bus. Moving the donkey will require a concentrated effort, and we need more carrots. So just to conclude, I really just want to say that it is sad that our society is a little bit moving towards a self-centered culture. We need to be more community centered. Our nation has seen massive progress when it comes to carbon emissions through decarbonisation of the grid, but we need to see the same step change in transport. So this is where we all come in, and this is where this event comes in. So I'm really pleased that we can be here together, that we'll be working together, and we'll be hearing from experts, people much more qualified than me, like Greg, who's going to be following me to tell us how to do it. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to seeing you later for one of the panel sessions.